With all the work that you've done in seminary, with your doctoral work in the area of theology and manuscripts, what got you interested in the Bible?
I realized that I was engaging with a lot of people, with Muslims, with Mormons, with Jehovah's Witnesses, skeptics of all different stripes. All of them would resort to some sort of, well, that sounds great, Wes, but all you're relying on is the Bible. That's your foundation. And you can't trust that. All you have are translations of translations of translations. All you have are error-ridden copies. You don't even know if you have the right books. You're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but have you ever heard of the Gospel of Thomas? And so I realized that that was a genuine critique if it was true. If that was true, I'm staking my entire life on the person of Jesus. And where do I find the information about Jesus? I find that in the Bible. And if I can't trust the Bible, I really have no reason to put my hope and trust in Jesus.
Hey, Andy Steiger here. We are in Egypt working on a new project called Can I Trust the Bible?
So part of the trickiness with the Bible is that we think of the Bible as one book because we have it in a nice single bound volume. But the Bible is not one book as much as it's 66 books. 66 books written over a period of 1,600 years on 3 different continents by close to 40 different authors in 3 different languages. 2 major languages, Greek and Hebrew, and 1 minor language, Aramaic. But you might be asking the question, well, why are Andy and I here in Egypt to talk about the complexities and issues regarding the Bible? When we're talking about the history of the Bible, the vast majority of those handwritten copies, what we call the manuscripts of the Bible, and particularly the earliest ones, come from Egypt.
Almost immediately after its production, the books of the Bible were being copied and translated into numerous languages and spread across the ancient world. This means that the modern English Bible we have today is some 2,000 years removed from even the last book written in it. How can we know that what we have was accurately copied and translated over that time? It was discoveries of ancient papyri in places like the city of Oxyrinchus that allow us to answer this question. This city, on the banks of the River Nile, was where papyrus was being grown and made into writing material. It was in the garbage dumps of Oxyrinchus where a treasure of ancient manuscripts was eventually discovered. In 1895, fresh graduate from Queen's College, England and Oxford, Bernard Grenfell and his friend Arthur Hunt left England on a trip to come to Egypt, sponsored by the Egyptian Exploration Society. Their purpose was not to find monumental architecture or statuary, which was the purpose of archaeology at the time, but to find papyri. After excavating a number of graveyards and cities to no avail, they eventually discovered here in and around the area of Al-Banasa, known then as Oxyrinchus papyri. In fact, between 1895 and 1897, over 500,000 papyri were discovered, including every book of the Bible and a number of influential classical and religious texts. I'm here at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and I'm looking at P1. P1 is the second manuscript discovered. The story goes that Grenfell was walking through the desert and looking down, saw a corner of what is now P1 sticking out of the sand. What was discovered by Grenfell and Hunt in that winter season was this fragment of the Gospel of Matthew, written on both sides, that contained the genealogy of Jesus from the beginning of that gospel.
Wes, I think a question that a lot of people ask is if these discoveries in places like Oxyrinchus are fairly recent discoveries of these ancient manuscripts, well, what were we relying on before then, and could we trust our Bible? I mean, when we're comparing the Bible that we've had to these ancient manuscripts, like how does it line up?
When they discovered the earliest copies of the papyri, really within the last 200 years, what it didn't do was alter the way that we understood the text of the Bible before that. Even though we had these large spans of time in between when the earliest copies or the originals are being written, and when we start to, think of the King James Bible in the early 17th century, when we discovered the papyri, what they didn't do was completely blow up how we understood the text of the Bible. In fact, what they did is simply confirm that what we had was surprisingly, shockingly close to the text that we had even centuries and millennia later.
From the time of the first copies down through the centuries, the Bible hasn't stopped being copied and translated. In fact, the New Testament writers themselves were using a translation, a copy of the Hebrew Old Testament books translated into Greek that we now call the Septuagint.
We're here in Alexandria, Egypt, at the Library of Alexandria, not the ancient Library of Alexandria, that hasn't been around for a long time. But Alexandria was a key and special place within both Jewish and Christian history. About 200 years before Jesus, the Old Testament, and particularly the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, were commissioned, most likely in Alexandria, to be transitioned out of the Hebrew and into the Greek. The Library of Alexandria, the ancient Library of Alexandria, and the city of Alexandria stood as a focus and an important key point geographically for both Jewish and Christian history.
Although translated into many languages, the Bible is not itself a translation of a translation. Like we see in the example of the Septuagint, Judeo-Christianity has always been a literary tradition that has never stopped copying and translating its books in order to be read. Almost immediately after its production, the books of the Bible were being copied and translated into numerous languages across the ancient world. When we look back at how we actually go from ancient papyrus to modern-day print, the history of the Bible is not some sort of layered web of translations. In reality, what we find ourselves with is a single step, going from the original Hebrew and Greek directly into our Bibles today. The translation of the Bible takes into consideration an amazing collection of archaeological evidence, from discoveries in Israel like the Dead Sea Scrolls, to papyri dug up in places like Oxyrhynchus. Over time, as we've uncovered more of these fragments and manuscripts, they haven't complicated our understanding of the Bible, but clarified it. The documents that sit behind the history of the Bible and the way that we translate them today gives us confidence in their reliability to go from the original languages into our own. Even though we're almost 2,000 years removed from the last book of the Bible that was written, as discoveries are made, we are not getting farther away from the text, but getting closer. This evidence confirms and gives us good reason to trust that our Bibles have been faithfully and accurately copied, and that what we have now is what the original authors wrote.
Hey, Andy here on the streets of Egypt. First thing you need to know is it's been about 40 degrees today. I hid from the sun. I've now ventured back out, and we're on the hunt for some food, looking for some street food. I'm personally a big fan of Egyptian food, but interestingly enough, they don't call it Egyptian food, they call it Oriental food. At the restaurant here, we got a couple different dishes. Got a soup going on, got some pita bread with some different sauces, dipping sauces. Got a very interesting, I think it's a dipping sauce here. It's like a spinach kind of. We got some I don't know. Kafka. I don't know.
Not Kafka.
So one thing I've always appreciated about the Bible is it's not trying to hide anything from you. It, in fact, will note when there is a difference, if it's a word or if something was missing in a different manuscript, it'll tell you.
Yeah, a lot of people, I think, when they see that there are differences within the manuscripts, they panic. They think that's a problem. And they see our Bible has been changed. And I would say, yes, that is true to a certain degree. But our Bible has been changed, and that doesn't give us a picture of confusion within the history of the Bible. It actually gives us clarity within understanding the text of the Bible. When we have these differences, The fact is, we know that there are the differences. So when you read your modern translation of the Bible and you see a citation note at the bottom of the page, that shouldn't make you panic. What that should do is give you confidence that we have such a glut of information that we're able to pinpoint those things to a very credible and exact level.
One of the things that catches a lot of people off guard when they're reading the Bible is they'll come across a verse that's missing, and that might surprise some of you, something like John chapter 5, verse 4. There isn't a John chapter 5, verse 4. So how do we understand that? Why are there verses in our Bible missing?
Yeah, I think people, when they come on these quote-unquote missing verses, it kind of surprises them. They'll look at their modern English translation and they'll see there's no John chapter 5, verse 4. And they go back and it's in their King James. So who took that verse out and when? Well, realistically, it's not about who took that verse out and when, it's about who put that verse in and when. And because we have such a glut of information in regards to the manuscript tradition and the text of the Bible, we're able to pinpoint when those things happened. Because of this, we're able to figure out, okay, a scribe at some point in history, say, wrote what we now have, because remember, the verses were added much later. They're not original to the text. The chapter and verse divisions were added in later centuries. And so when we find out John didn't write what we have in John chapter 5, verse 4, but a later scribe wrote that, well, we don't reverse the entire Bible. That's going to mess up all of our Bible memorization. It's going to mess up all of the commentaries that have been written throughout history that do include the verses. And so what we do is we simply put John chapter 5, verse 4, and we add a citation note at the end of the page.
Okay, the earlier we go and the more we look at the different manuscripts, we can see that this was added at this point. And again, we're going to footnote that and say that shouldn't be there.
And the ancient scribes did their own version of footnoting. When we discovered the story of the woman caught in adultery in the Gospel of John is missing from our earliest papyri, it didn't blow up the way we understood that story. Scribes all along have been noting some copies that we have it, some copies that we have don't have it, and so they're adding little scribal notations to say, we're not sure about this text, we're not sure about that text, but they would include things even if they weren't sure whether it was part of the original or not. You know, we have not 100% of the text, we have 110% of the text, because what that means is that even though things were added, the scribes were so tenacious to include everything that the original text is in there. And it's kind of like a puzzle. If you had a puzzle with 100,000 pieces and you opened it up and you found that you actually had not 100,000 pieces, but 100,100 pieces, once you start to put the puzzle together, you can see where the image is. You can see where pieces were added from another puzzle by accident, or maybe that someone came along and they added extra pieces. Once the picture starts to come together, it's really clear to figure out, well, what does and doesn't belong. And that's kind of like the text of the Bible. Once we put together the pieces of the text of the Bible, we can see this piece doesn't belong, this piece does belong.
That being the case, Wes, why do the scribes make some of these changes in the text?
Well, a lot of them are just mistakes, and mistakes you and I would make if we were handwriting documents. You know, I do this all the time.
I do this a lot.
In my emails, all my frums are forms, that kind of thing. It doesn't have to be handwriting, but when you're dealing with handwriting, we do make mistakes. The vast majority of these textual variants, of these scribal changes, are spelling differences. Because remember, spelling was not organized or standardized till much later. But if I spell Andy with 2 D's or 1 D, you can still figure out that I'm trying to write Andy. And a lot of them, they didn't even necessarily catch these changes. So the vast majority are things like spelling, our word order. You know, as long as there are particular grammatical and syntactical linguistic clues, we can figure out what the sentence says. So the vast majority of these differences within the Bible are inconsequential and make no difference in the translation out of the original language.
I think a question that a lot of people might be asking is, well, how big are these variances? Are these significant? Are they doctrinal in nature?
Even though we have these differences, no textual variants affect any essential Christian doctrine. There's nothing that relies on one verse that has a question about it in the history of the textual traditions of the Bible.
Hey, we're here in the White Desert. We've been going in a Land Cruiser for a couple hours now out in the desert. Just absolutely stunning, beautiful. We've pulled over and we're doing like an Egyptian picnic. Our driver here is making us some delicious food. Really looking forward to it. Now, here in Egypt, travel takes a long time. And one of the reasons is because we are stopped once again at a security checkpoint. The whole way along, we've had to have police escorts as we've been going from different cities. And this one is a particularly long one as we're waiting for the police to decide if we can go through. And if we do, we're probably going to need another police escort. So this is going to be an interesting day. This is our first police escort of the day. But we have had many here in Egypt.
So Wes, we have confidence that what we have in our New Testament is what the original authors wrote, and the books that we have are the documents that get us closest to the time frame of Jesus. But it could very well be the case that we just have the most historically attested lies.
We could have what the original authors wrote, like you said, but they just could have made it up. Or they could have been diluted. So how do we know that it's not only the right words that were written on those ancient documents, but that it's true?
Luke goes to lengths to demonstrate that his narrative is placed within an actual time and location. In the first 3 verses of Luke chapter 3, we are not only given 7 historical characters that mark out the beginning of the ministry of John the Baptist, but within these 3 verses alone are 22 historical references to locations and people that have been verified by archaeology and ancient literary sources outside of the Bible. This places Luke's account within a historical framework, making sure his readers know he's not merely making up a story, but pinpointing when and where these events actually took place in history. And the Gospel authors do this in multiple different ways, with names, locations, as well as with accurate plant and animal life related to the areas within the narratives they are describing. The Gospel authors get these types of facts right, even when other ancient writers of the time don't.
It's the details that make the difference. The Gospel authors are going to lengths to try to communicate that what they are saying is history. Right at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, in his preface, he says that he's writing up an orderly account. That term, account, that he uses in the original language in Greek is the same word that other ancient writers like Josephus and Lucian use when they talk simply about how to write good history. The Gospel authors, they want to make sure you know that what they're writing is not just important, but that it's actually true. One of the most important ancient writers within this time period is a guy named Tacitus. In Tacitus's Annals, Book 1544, he describes what the Christians are doing and believing in that time, and he says that Jesus Christ was crucified under Pontius Pilate. But he describes Pontius Pilate as being the procurator. Now, that is actually not the right description of what Pontius Pilate was. You know, in 1961, in Caesarea Maritime, there was a stone that was found, which is known as the Pontius Pilate stone, which has the title of Pontius Pilate, governor of this area. But you know who gets the right title for Pontius Pilate? Luke. Luke, in his gospel, accurately describes and uses the correct Greek term for Pontius Pilate being the governor of Judea. This is something that one of the most prominent ancient writers during that time, of which we know most of our information, or a good portion at least of our information, about who the ancient emperors were, he gets this title wrong, whereas the gospel authors get it right.
Our journey through the sands of Egypt has shown that we have the right books that make up the Bible. The gospel biographies of Jesus included within it get us in closest proximity to his life and teaching. Its books have been faithfully preserved and seek to give us an accurate history of the events that actually took place. Although we sit thousands of years downstream from the events recorded in these ancient documents, there are good reasons to believe that you can trust the Bible.